In March of last year, they released the very first issue of Superman Red and Blue, #1. The very first story was from John Ridley. I covered it pretty extensively on the channel. I believe I did 2 videos, and it certainly implied that Superman is sexually assaulted while in captivity during a previous story that had been told. And here to talk with me about that is my good friend from PopBuyCulture.com and DC aficionado himself, Josh. How you doing, Josh?
Doing well, Wes. How are you?
I'm doing all right.
Yeah.
Where did this thing come from? I know I covered it in my end of the year, like worst comic books of 2021. And then next thing I know, everyone's talking about this like it's new. This has been out for 9 months.
It's been out for 9 months, but they just collected the trade and it was released last week. So I think that's why you're seeing it pop up. When you have anthology books like this, there's less of an urgency from readers to go pick up the issue monthly. So I think a majority of the people that are probably reading this are just now reading it for the first time. So if you're wondering, like, okay, if this was published all the way back in what you said, March, I think, April, somewhere along in there.
March, yes.
Yeah. Why is it coming up now? That is why the trade got published. People went and picked it up. It's the better price offering, so it makes more sense if you're on a budget. It's one of the first stories in the book. So
it is the very first story.
Yeah.
It was their first foot forward for Batman or Superman Red and Blue. I think that was a big mistake because that kind of sets the tone for the book and what they want to accomplish in it. I was personally very turned off to it. Obviously, I made a couple of videos about it. What were your thoughts on this story?
I mean, it's one of those situations that for me, it just comes across as the writers trying to do something that is dramatic. And how can I like shock people and catch their attention? John Ridley did it in a way that if people got too upset, he could be like, no, that's not what I was going for. You just misunderstood. And if people were like, oh, that's dark. Was that? And he could just kind of be like, hey, you might be onto something. Yeah, you tell me. But I think more than anything, he was going for shock value, was trying to think of a way that he could put Superman, who's often seen as this like embodiment of power, in the most vulnerable and weak position possible, and didn't want to just go with you're weakened by kryptonite, so a punch can hurt you, or we can physically torture you. I think he wanted to take it further to show some type of even mental or emotional torture. So, reference rape.
I have had some people come into the channel and say, you're misinterpreting this. That's not what he was going for. Balderdash. I read the fucking story, and that's the first thing that popped in my mind. I know lots of friends that have went all through the seer trading and stuff, and when you're in captivity, absolutely, that's exactly what he was going for.
Oh,
and you're not going to convince me otherwise, Josh.
No, same. I mean, the exact, and because I wrote down the exact lines, and the exact lines were, every day they left me exposed and vulnerable. Every day for 8 months, and it's got an ellipses, and then it says, they did things to me. Exposed and vulnerable, like vulnerable, fine. You've got kryptonite, you can't defend yourself, you don't have your strength. But exposed, like, to me, that's the key word there. Ridley, I think he knew what he was doing when he wrote this the way that he wrote it. If people don't want to believe it, fine, but don't chastise people that do believe it. Because, history kind of shows that people in captivity get raped. You look back to World War II. It's not publicly talked about often, but there are stories of people getting raped. If you go back to the Bible, Sodom and Gomorrah is about people wanting to rape new people in the town. Like, it happens, but it's just a shitty thing to kind of do to a superhero that's supposed to be so positive and so uplifting.
Prior to this, he did the history of the other history of the DC universe #1, and he had his Black Lightning story. And in there, he basically describes Superman as like this great white hero. And, he's not saying it in a positive light. To me, that didn't feel like Black Lightning. I've read the first Black Lightning story when he met for Superman for the first time, and it didn't go like that. It felt like John Ridley was saying that's how he interpreted Superman. And the way I took it is when the first time he gets a chance to really write a Superman story in this, he wanted to take some liberties with the character. And I think it was absolutely intentional.
It seems like Ridley is not fond of Superman, and I'm not going to say that is how he feels, so don't put words in my mouth, but it comes across like he's not fond of Superman by the way he writes Superman, and especially his other history of the DC universe. Like, I completely agree with you. It seems like he wrote Superman as this kind of like, almost with a white supremacist type slant of like, oh, here's the white knight coming, like saving the black people. Like, there was definitely like a tone to it, and I don't agree with it, and I think it's not fitting for Superman because Superman's always kind of been viewed as an alien. you know, and that's so much of his character is his character trying to fit in. So it just seemed weird. And maybe that was Ridley's point of like, oh, you got a white guy trying to fit in. Like, all right, cool, whatever. But there's still a story there.
In that other history of the DC universe, he says specifically that Superman doesn't try to protect the people in the black side of town because he doesn't have any use for him, which is absolutely BS. If you go read those initial stories of Black Lightning, they explain Superman is patrolling, and every time they see him, they hide. And when he leaves, they go back to doing what they were doing. So they needed somebody on the streets. Yeah. And that's why he came forward and started protecting his neighborhood. It wasn't because Superman didn't have the time. It was because they were evading him. They had, practices in place to not be discovered. And then he's taking it to a whole nother level because I don't know John Ridley, but it feels like he has something personal against Superman, and he feels like he represents like some like white superiority or something.
You also have to look at it from the perspective of, all right, so Superman's going to go fight criminals at a street level. So you got these muggers and these robbers. That story's going to be over with in 2 pages. Like, you're not going to have a story. So, there's a logistics thing here too of why that was probably set up that way. I agree. I feel like Ridley just has something against Superman.
Well, here's the bigger problem. I think DC editorial almost has to have something against Superman to allow this story to be the very first thing in there on this new anthology series that was supposed to be important.
I don't think DC editorial is paying as much attention or thinking things through overall as much as they should be or need to be. I'm sure they just kind of were like, all right, cool. And I wouldn't be surprised if they didn't even read this in depth like they should have. I think they're like, are the pages there? Does it look all right? Great, pass it on. But no, someone should have caught this. Someone should have said something. Someone should have at least had enough wherewithal to say, all right, you know what? Cool, we'll do the story, but this shouldn't be the first story. Start with something that's more traditional for Superman. And then you can have things that show okay, we're going to take a different route. Because that's usually what these little anthology books are for. It lets you approach things from a different perspective with a different artist, do something non-traditional. But to lead with that, you're saying, here's the tone of the book. And I'm sure a lot of people read this and were like, well, I don't want to read this, and probably stop.
Which is unfortunate because you get to Red and Blue #5 and you have one of the best comic stories of the year involving Superman.
Absolutely.
But like I said, I can't lay it all on the feet of John Ridley. I do think the Superman group editor, who obviously has gone from the company at this point, they've gone through 2 of them now. Hey, you're being paid to do a job. It's to protect the integrity of the Superman IP and the character. And I hope you were fired, to be completely honest. I hope you didn't just quit and go find greener pastures. I hope they said, get your ass out of here, because this isn't how we treat one of the few A-list characters that can draw in numbers, and perhaps the comics aren't selling like they should, but certainly is making a lot of money outside of comics and should be protected as somebody that's important and the very first superhero that pretty much started this entire industry, and is the reason John Ridley can get paid to write comic books, whether he likes it or not.
I always have this toy box mentality. If you're going to write characters that are part of a brand that are ongoing, you get to play with the toys, but don't break the toys because someone has to come in and play with them after you. And that notion seems to have been forgotten with a lot of comic book writers right now. And there's also part of me too that just wonders if DC is trying so hard to build up John Kent that they're looking at how can we diminish Superman's light in some ways to make John shine brighter. And I've always been a firm believer, you're not going to make another candle shine brighter just by blowing another one out. If that is a thought process or that is a mindset that's going on here, stop.
I don't think this story gets told under Dan Didio. And by that, I mean, I think the leadership has taken a turn for the worse at DC Comics, and I don't see brighter days ahead until they start taking their job a little bit more seriously and really starting protecting the integrity of these characters.
Absolutely. I completely agree there. I think just across the board at DC, they need to look at the integrity of their characters and make that a priority. And if they do, I think you'll start seeing better stories come out. But, it's weird because John Ridley is a seasoned writer, but you have a lot of unseasoned writers trying to write things to get shock value so they can gain some type of momentum or intrigue. And I would like to think he's better than this, but with what he's been doing lately, I don't know if Ridley is.
If you go read Black Panther, it's pretty damn good. But apparently that's probably a character that he respects and likes.
Yeah.
As I mentioned earlier in the video, I did a year-end review of the very worst comic books of 2021. This is definitely prominently on there. I think you should check this video out. Also, if you're interested on the way that I covered it when I originally talked about Superman Red and Blue #1. That video is up here, so take your pick. I think you'll like both of them, and they'll be very informative.